Most people remember Charlotte's Web as a cute and cozy childhood story about empathy and friendship. Loving, moral, sad at times, yes, but nonetheless a comfort book to many. That's how I remembered it too. However, rereading it now, in the context of literature and the environment, I was actually surprised by how uneasy it made me feel. Not because of any dramatic catastrophe, but because of how ordinary the harm the story is. When read ecocritically, it becomes a text that asks a far more unsettling question. How do humans justify control over non-human life, especially in everyday agricultural spaces? Charlotte's Web was published in 1952 by E.B. White, a writer known for his environmental sensitivity and attention to everyday rural life and farming. This was a period when agriculture in the United States was becoming increasingly industrial, and animals were more firmly framed as resources rather than lives. Set on a small family farm, the story explores the relationship between humans, animals, and agriculture at an intimate scale. What struck me first on reread is that White doesn't set the novel in a distant wilderness or a dystopian future. He sets it someplace much more familiar to the contemporary reader, the kind of place where environmental decisions don't look like environmental issues at all, they just look like routine. In this podcast, I want to explore how Charlotte's Web represents a relationship between humans and the natural world through a non-human agency, environmental ethics, and animal rights, challenging anthropocentric assumptions about animals as disposable resources. First and foremost, one of the most important aspects of Charlotte's Web is the representation of non-human beings as conscious entities, with different personalities, moral compasses, inner lives, and self-agency. The sheep are haughty, the goose and gander are proud and nurturing parents, the rat is greedy and selfish. The novel centers Wilbur the pig, a vulnerable non-human subject, as the narrative protagonist. In the rising action of the story, when Wilbur learns that he is going to be killed, his reaction isn't symbolic or exaggerated. He panics, he cries, he screams for someone to save him and repeats, "I don't want to die." What stayed with me here is how little the novel tries to soften that moment. There's no metaphor and no lesson wrapped around it. It's just his fear. Eco-critically, I think this matters because it interrupts the usual way farming narratives distance humans from animal death. In this moment, Wilbur, our narrative protagonist, isn't livestock. He's a living being experiencing dread. This forces readers to confront slaughter from the animal's perspective, not the farmer's. The co-protagonist, Charlotte the Spider, complicates this moment in the book even further. She isn't portrayed as cute nor innocent. In fact, she kills insects to feed on their blood. She understands death and accepts it as a part of life. This co-protagonist is the one who chooses to intervene with our narrative protagonist's fate, aided by other animals in the barn who chip in with their ideas during meetings and convince the rat to bring new vocabulary that she can spin into her web. This web, a team effort, becomes a form of ethical action, not because it changes the system, but because it forces humans to look. Despite being animals that are confined in the barn belonging to humans, they all do what they can with the tools they have, and it's a perfect example of non-human agency. All this helps set something straight, right from the beginning of the book. Animals in Charlotte's Web are not symbolic props. They are thinking, communicating beings with emotional and moral depth. It is them who seize the narrative and drive the plot forwards. Next up, let's talk about environmental ethics and ethical agency in the novel. This idea, I believe, is best embodied by the primary ethical agent, moral co-protagonist Charlotte the Spider. To me, she is the character with the most narrative agency. It is she who changes the course of many events to save the narrative protagonist's life. She is capable of this because she understands the system, works within it, and uses language strategically to alter human perception. What makes her actions more meaningful is that they come at a personal cost to her. Charlotte doesn't benefit from saving Wilbur. In fact, it exhausts her to spin her webs to spell out messages for him. Her labor mirrors ecological stewardship: small, local, relational, and sacrificial. Read this way, Charlotte's sacrifice reflects a broader environmental reality. Ecosystems are preserved not because it's easy or rewarding, but because someone, human or non-human, bears the cost. Charlotte's death, in the end, does not cancel the value of her care. It exposes how fragile and demanding ethical action within ecological systems can be. Another supporting protagonist that exercises environmental ethics and ethical agency is Fern, a young human girl whose early empathy disrupts adult normalization of violence. When her father plans to kill Wilbur simply because he was the runt of a litter, she protests. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of," she says. Fern's reaction exposes how moral desensitization towards animals and ethical blindness is learned, not natural. In contrast, the adult human character's decisions about our narrative protagonist Wilbur's life are framed as practical, even reasonable. Her father isn't cruel, he's efficient. And by the way, this reminds me of Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, environmental harm that is gradual, normalized, and hidden by routine. In Charlotte's Web, the killing of runts is not violent on the page. It's simply an accepted reality of farm life. No single antagonist causes harm, yet this threat exists quietly throughout the narrative. This mirrors environmental degradation today, where destruction occurs through ordinary legal practices every single day. No fuss, just business as usual. Because of how routine it all feels, the supporting protagonist's reaction feels emotional and childish to the adults. However, to the eye of somebody who hasn't yet learned to treat harm as normal, taking the life of an innocent and helpless creature is unforgivably cruel. Reading from this point of view, we readers find ourselves unanimously siding with Fern. Finally, I would like to observe how this novel critiques the way farming culture creates moral distance between humans and animals. Our narrative protagonist is named, spoken to, and emotionally engaged with until adult logic reframes him as meat. This shift mirrors what eco-critics identify as linguistic distancing, where animals become pork or livestock rather than individuals. The county fair further intensifies this critique. On the surface, the fair celebrates farming, but it also turns animals into objects, to be judged, to be ranked, and to be displayed. Although our narrative protagonist is saved by the extraordinary web that spells words and his own performance, the system itself doesn't change. Other animals are still destined for slaughter. What unsettled me here is that the narrative protagonist's survival doesn't challenge farming culture. It depends on being an exception to it. This feels uncomfortably close to how ethical concern works today. We care deeply about certain animals, maybe the ones that are cuter or endangered, while accepting the suffering of others as unavoidable in the same breath. White doesn't resolve this contradiction. He leaves it there. To deepen this reading of Charlotte's Web, I want to connect the novel alongside Dale Jamieson's essay Against Zoos, which critiques institutions that manage animal lives under human control, even when those institutions present themselves as humane or caring. Although Jamieson is writing about zoos rather than farms, his argument helps articulate a tension that runs quietly through Charlotte's Web. Jamieson argues that the central ethical problem with zoos is not cruelty but control. Animals may be fed, protected, and even admired, yet their lives are still structured entirely around human priorities. This framework maps closely onto our narrative protagonist Wilbur's situation. From the start of the novel, Wilbur's life is never really his own. He's spared as a piglet only because a supporting protagonist intervenes, and even then, his survival is temporary and dependent of the will of humans he belongs to, as well as the gains he brings them. His eventual death is often discussed calmly as part of the normal functioning of the farm. No one is cruel. The system is simply doing what it was designed to do. What saves our narrative protagonist is not a rejection of that system, but a change in how he is valued. Once the co-protagonist Charlotte writes words like some pig and terrific into her web, Wilbur ceases being just a pig and becomes Zuckerman's famous pig. His life gains worth because it now produces pride, spectacle, and reputation for humans. In this sense, our narrative protagonist is not freed, he is reclassified. This aligns closely with Jamieson's concern that institutions often justify animal captivity by reframing animals as educational, entertaining, or exceptional, without questioning the power imbalance nor legitimacy of human control itself. Charlotte's Web stages a similar ethical compromise. What makes this comparison especially unsettling is that neither text relies on villains. In Charlotte's Web, the farmers are not sadistic. In Jamieson's critique, zookeepers are not monsters. The ethical discomfort comes precisely from the ordinariness. For me, Jamieson's essay helps explain why Charlotte's Web has always felt quietly unresolved. The protagonist we have come to care deeply for lives, but nothing fundamentally changes, and the moral question remains unanswered. Like Jamieson's critique, the novel refuses to offer sufficient moral closure. Instead, it simply offers survival under conditions that humans still control. It asks us to sit with the uneasy question of whether care is enough when freedom is absent, and invites us to think seriously about how humans manage animal lives. Approaching the conclusion, I'd like to say that what keeps Charlotte's Web so powerful across generations is its intimacy and focus on everyday attention. It reminds us that animals have their own thoughts, feelings, and value, beyond just what's convenient for humans. A key takeaway here is that environmental and animal ethics aren't just abstract principles or big policies. They're enacted through small, conscious daily acts of care. In a world where harm is often normalized and hidden behind what's normal, this story makes us think about our own role in systems that control non-human lives. For me, the lasting message is simple but profound. Care matters, even if it can't fix the system permanently. Our responsibility to non-human life is ongoing, important, and deeply meaningful. A lesson that still resonates just as strongly today as it did when E.B. White first wrote it.